Welcome back. Well, as promised, here I am. We are going to talk about disaster preparedness. And I know you're probably thinking, oh, for goodness sake, Sue, why couldn't you have done this 2 or 3 months ago? Well, I'm kicking myself for that one too. But let's be fair, 2 or 3 months ago, I don't think anybody would have been ready to hear this. I don't think anybody would have listened. So now that I have your attention, let's start talking plans. I'll be back in a minute. Okay, you can go all over the internet and find plans for emergency preparedness, survival of disasters, everything from how to keep your family comfortable for a weekend without power, right up to the let's go up into the woods and write our manifesto stuff. That's not what we're going to do here. And the reason why is nobody else's plan is going to work for you. You can go on the internet. Yes, you can find 100 plans. But are any of those plans going to be right for you? Not likely. That's because your circumstances are not the same as everyone else's. They're not the same as mine. They're not the same as the guy next door. And his plan, your plan, they're not going to work for me. My plan's not going to work for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a system that will help you to create your own plan that will address your own circumstances. Because if it doesn't work for you, it's not working. So the system, I call it Airport. This is my own system. I worked this one out about 20 years ago. Just about 20 years. It was in the wake of 9/11. So it was about 20 years ago. And I realized that most of us are not prepared for disasters, certainly not the scope of the disaster that hit New York that day. And I started thinking about how do you put together a system that allows anyone to use it to create their own plan. Because it was immediately apparent to me that it's not a one-size-fits-all proposition. So my system is Airport. And yes, obviously it was a little influenced by 9/11, but Airport is just an acronym. It's just a mnemonic device, AIRPORT. Assessment, inventory, resources, planning, organization, review, testing. That's what our overview is. And I want you to have the overview before we get started because I don't like signing on to a road trip unless I know where it's going. And I want you to see that we're heading somewhere with all of this. So let's start talking about the individual phases. Again, this is just an overview. In subsequent videos, we're going to go in depth into the process so you can create your own plan. Right now, we're just going to sketch it out in broad strokes. The first step is our A, assessment. You need to assess your individual circumstances, your domestic arrangements, what's the composition of your family. Do you have children? Do you have elderly parents you're caring for? Do you have a lot of pets? All of these things need to be taken into consideration when you start creating your plan. So look at your family and take a look at all kinds of things. In other words, are there people in your household that lose their heads in a crisis? Are there people in your household that are not especially fit or have health issues or mobility issues that need to be considered? you're going to have to plan around this. Do you have issues of health or mobility that might make things a little more challenging for you than for other people? Again, that goes into your assessment. Where do you live? Where you live is important because in certain parts of the country, certain types of natural disasters are just more likely to take place. If you are in New Hampshire, the idea of getting snowed into your house, especially if you're in rural New Hampshire, is probably something you face every single winter. And if you're in Florida, it's not an issue at all. You probably haven't seen snow in 20 years. You're looking at things like hurricanes, heat waves. That's the sort of thing that could create serious problems for you. If you're in California, well, if you're in Southern California, I have long believed that the riders of the apocalypse stable their horses in Los Angeles. They have mudslides, earthquakes, brush fires, riots. If anything can go wrong, it's going wrong in Los Angeles. They have a lot of things to worry about. If you're in the Mississippi flood basin, obviously flooding. If you're in Nebraska, tornadoes. So where you live makes a difference. That goes into your assessment. Also things like, do you live in an apartment in a city where the crime rate is high? That could make things like sheltering in place less attractive for you. And it might make evacuation more attractive in an emergency. And also keep in mind when we go through this, we have two threads going through this: shelter in place and evacuation. We will need to plan and prepare for both because we don't always have a choice. You might say to yourself, I would prefer to shelter in place. Well, when the floodwaters start rising, the National Guard could come knocking on your door and force an evacuation. And we all heard stories, just horror stories, of the forced evacuations and what happened in those evacuation centers during Hurricane Katrina in Los Angeles. And I'm sure most of us know we don't want to be on the wrong end of that. If we have to evacuate, we're better off doing it on our own terms than waiting too long and having someone else force our hand. Sheltering in place, again, we want to do that on our own terms. But those are the two threads that will run through our plan: evacuation, shelter in place. We prepare for both, but we will, as we go along, be sort of automatically determining which is our preference. If in your household you have elderly parents who are not mobile, evacuation is probably not going to be your first choice, but it is something you're going to have to plan on. So that is our assessment phase. Then from there, we will go into inventory. When we look at inventory, we're going to look at everything we have, everything we're going to need. Everything we have is not only stuff, it's skills. So if you have a family of 4 and you're thinking, well, gee, back in the assessment phase, when we were talking about that, and as I say, we're going to talk about that in more detail. When we were talking about that, I decided that because one of my children has severe disabilities, I want to shelter in place. I have a family of 4, and that means what? I need meals for 4 people, 3 meals a day for what, 3 weeks? It's 253 meals. That can be a very sort of scary concept. But when we start looking at this as not just our inventory of stuff, but our inventory of skills, then we start to look at things like food preservation. Do we know how to do home canning? Do we have a garden? Things like that. That's all part of our inventory. When we move from inventory, we're going to go on to resources. Now, the resource phase is where we take the stuff we have, and we determine that in our inventory phase, and contrast it to the stuff we need. Resources is what fills that gap. That's when we're going to go on the internet. We're going to take a look at things like information on food storage at home, information on first aid, especially if we have at-risk family members, then we think we might have to shelter in place for any length of time. We're probably going to need a good first aid manual. We might even need some courses. That's when we're going to take a look at our local extension courses from the universities, or from my township does this. The local fire departments do CPR courses, things like that. So resources is the stuff that will provide us with the rest of the stuff we need. Internet is a great resource. When I first developed this plan 20 years ago, not everyone had access to the internet. Almost everyone does now. That's huge. That is going to make the resource phase of our plan just a complete piece of cake. From resources, we're going to move into planning. And this is where we're going to create our specific plan. 2 plans. Our A plan, the one we prefer, and our B plan, the one we will use if it becomes necessary. So we're going to have a shelter-in-place plan and an evacuation plan. That's our planning phase. I know that sounds daunting, but the steps before, the assessment, the inventory, and the location of resources, is going to make everything pretty much fall into place for us in terms of planning. Oh, that's our next part. It's organization. That's when we are going to organize all of this together. If we are going to plan on sheltering in place, and of course we should at least have that as a plan, even if we prefer to evacuate, we are going to need, to acquire food. We're going to need toilet paper. We've seen that already. We are going to need supplies. We are going to need to know how to store water safely. We are not going to store gasoline. By the way, in most municipalities, that's illegal, so we're not going to touch that. If it's legal in your area, feel free, you be my guest, but it's not something I'm advocating because it's been determined to be dangerous, and as I say, in many places it's illegal, so that I will leave to you. We will call it a matter of your own conscience, what you want to do about that. But things like storing food and water and necessary supplies, medications, how we deal with that is in our organizing phase. Then the next phase is going to be our review. At this point, we will have already started acquiring things to make our lives easier if we have to evacuate or shelter in place. And then we're going to be able to start reviewing. Because especially when we start looking at storing food, the motto there is store what you eat what you store. So it's not as if we're going to be packing food away in the back of a closet and never touching it. We are going to be pulling that food out, putting it on the dinner table, and replacing it. So the food is going to stay fresh. It's going to get used. Things like that, that's part of our review. We're going to look at that and see if these are the things that our family is eating. Do they like it? Is this going over well? Do we have enough entertainment materials? What if we were stuck inside without power? What if we didn't have television? What if we didn't have internet? What if the kids didn't have their Game Boys? We've got to start looking at that. The review process is going to sort of throw those little red flags up to us. The final phase is going to be testing. We can test our evacuation plan by throwing a couple of backpacks in the trunk of the car and going off camping. We can test our shelter in place by wake up one Saturday morning, flip the main breaker and say, okay, everybody, we got no power for the weekend. Or conversely, you can plan this well in advance. You can say, well, the third weekend in May, we're going to live without power. Make sure the kids know this in advance so they can plan for this so that nobody is saying, you're screwing up my homework. It's not really very hard. Keep in mind, our grandparents did this as a way of life. For most of us, our grandparents did not have access to regular supplies of food. They were probably not living in the cities. They may have been out on farms. They would have to store their own food. They'd have to do their own food canning. That was just the way life worked. And so, in a sense, all we're doing is reclaiming some of the skills that our grandparents had. They wouldn't have been worried if there was no power because half the time they didn't have power to begin with. What's the problem? They didn't have the internet, they didn't have television, they didn't have Game Boys, and they all survived very nicely, didn't they? Certainly they all survived long enough to guarantee that we would be here. Right now, the situation that we are facing is very fortunate. In terms of disasters, this is one of the best that we could have. Now that sounds odd, but look, we have our power, we have our water, our infrastructure is untouched, we have our emergency services. What we are missing is that we can't go out to restaurants, the kids are not in school. These are not insignificant things, don't get me wrong. Especially the kids not being in school, that frightens the daylights out of me. This isn't as bad as it could be. So as far as disasters go, it's a pretty gosh darn good one. It's a user-friendly disaster. We will survive this. And right now, what I say we do is, since we've been given lemons, let's make some lemonade. Let's take this disaster, this difficult time, and learn everything we can from it so that if we face this again, we are prepared. What we learn right now from sheltering in place in a pandemic is going to stand us in good stead the next time we get snowed in New Hampshire, the next time we have to evacuate in Florida, the next time the four horsemen of the apocalypse land in Los Angeles. We're going to learn from this, and hopefully we're going to come out the other end better educated, better prepared, and more self-reliant than we were when we went into it. So, I will see you next time. Next time, we are going to talk about the first step of our plan. Remember, that is assessment. We're going to talk about how to assess your circumstances, and I'm going to give you some real-world examples of families, real families, and how their circumstances might impact their plans, so that you get some idea of how to create your own assessment. Meantime, take care, stay safe, keep your spirits up, and remember, I'll be here with you. See you later.